All right, Derek, here we go. We made it. Playoff show number one. Notable that it's number one because we have two wild card previews coming because we just didn't think we could fit it all into one show. So we're about to do the AFC wild card weekend. How are you feeling right now?
More excited than I thought because I feel like leading into the playoffs, like the last 3 or so weeks of the season, there was so much work of like, man, the NFC is going to be so tight. The NFC games are going to be so good. And then actually, the more I dug into this AFC slate and really started to think about it, I'm like, I don't know, man. These AFC games are a lot closer and better than I thought maybe they would be 3 weeks ago. So I'm very excited.
We have a couple touchdown plus favorites in these games. We'll dig into some of the details behind that and why, for at least one of them, I actually am more interested in that game than the line would probably suggest to you. But the first game we're going to dig into here is set up to be a very close game. All of these games are presented by BetMGM. We're just going to go in chronological order here. Chargers at Texans, the what has become the wild card weekend special. The Houston Texans playing at 4:30 Eastern on Saturday. The Justin Herbert and the Chargers visiting those Texans in the wild card round. For all these games, before we dig into the nitty gritty on both sides of the ball, I kind of just want to talk about how we got here and how we're feeling about these teams as the playoffs start. And I want to begin that conversation with the Texans because a year ago at this time, the Texans were playing an absurdly entertaining wild card game or set up to play an absurdly entertaining wild card game against the Cleveland Browns. It was a fantastic moment for CJ Stroud. I was in Detroit watching that game in a hotel room. I remember it vividly. And it really did feel like the Texans were the toast of the town. They were one of the most exciting stories about the NFL last year. Everyone was so pumped about what DeMeco Ryans and CJ Stroud had done in year one. Fast forward a year, and things feel very different. And I think part of the reason it's so stark, the lack of excitement around these Texans, is that the Chargers are now that team where the vibes feel like they're at an all-time high, and there just isn't that sort of feeling around the Texans, where a year ago it just seemed like the arrow was going to be going up into infinity, and now it's just really hard to get excited about what this Texans team is and where they are in this moment.
It's kind of funny that last year the Texans team, they got the Saturday afternoon game or whatever because you had been so bad for so long and then you finally squeeze by your division. You're really fun. It's like, all right, first time in the dance, you guys get to we're going to push you off to the side, but this is really cool that you got in. And it still felt fun. You wanted to go watch it. Now they've been cast aside to this game because it's like, all right, you guys, yeah, okay, you won your division, but like, what are we really doing here? You're probably the most frustrating team among the division winners. I would say, like, even more than the Bucks. Like, so I think that is why it feels so. It just doesn't feel like this team has the same juice that it did last year. And then I think another interesting point, you mentioned that these teams are kind of moving in different directions as organizations. This is a Texans team that we were so excited about last year. Now I think we're not quite as excited, particularly about the offense and about the way that the quarterback is played. Whereas the Chargers went from one of the most downtrodden franchises to immediately Jim Harbaugh doing his thing and reviving them instantly to being one of the most exciting teams. If you looked at the line in this game, I think when it opened, it was closer to like 1.5 in favor of the Chargers, and now it's closer to 3. So it's like, okay, we're the line has indicated exactly how both of these organizations and franchises are moving.
I think a lot of people thought the Texans were going to be a surefire playoff team. Some people, myself included, expected them to potentially go deep into the playoffs after looking what they looked like last year and then adding a bunch of talent this offseason. They are now home underdogs to a team that has Justin Herbert, Lad McConkey, and like not a lot that you'd be excited about on offense. I know the tackles are good, but this Chargers team is very much in stage one of what we hope they can become. And they are already a field goal favorite on the road against this Texans team. And I think that says a lot about where both these teams are right now.
I want to actually ask you the question: which one of these is more surprising? Is it that the Texans kind of had
Oh,
a
the
middling
Texans. It's
season?
absolutely the
Okay,
Texans.
okay.
I think that the Texans, we've talked about this so much, but I absolutely think it's the Texans. I didn't necessarily, I wasn't ready to pencil in the Chargers as a playoff team just because I wasn't sure what the offense was going to look like sans weapons. You know, McConkey, I really liked him coming out. I'm watching him at Georgia, and when we were talking about the receivers last year, I really did think if he stayed healthy, he would have a chance to be a really good player. Obviously, you pair that with Alt, and you have a chance to double dip and kind of supercharge two areas of need on offense, but they still had so many other holes. And the defense, they did nothing to improve the defense. Like if you look at what they did and the pieces they added this offseason, it was all these incremental 1 year moves. Your Christian Fultons, Tyir Tart, Puna Forward. So even if you looked at what Jesse Minter did at Michigan and said, all right, this is a well coordinated defense. Like it's filled with modern ideas. The defense that is taking over the NFL from the schematic level on the pro side of things with the Ravens and 4, 5, 6 teams now running that system. You're bringing that along. There isn't the same imagination necessary as there might be with other college systems coming up to the NFL. But even if you were super optimistic about all of those things on that side of the ball, I think there was a lot of reason to believe that the talent would hold them back. And so for them to perform or outperform the talent level on defense to such an extent to really unlock this version of Justin Herbert and have him play the best football that we've probably seen him play since he was a rookie, I think that's not shocking, but I still think that there was a path to do that. The Texans, I just did not anticipate them outside of catastrophic levels of injury. And I know that they've been hurt a little bit at the receiver spots, but I just them being like a definitive below average offense without losing every single notable player, including the quarterback, that to me is one of the most surprising things about the entire season.
I think I agree. I think what's funny though is if you told me the Texans only squeaked by in the division and kind of did what they did in terms of their record, I don't think that would have been that surprising. But to me, it would have
Yeah,
been
the
like
win losses maybe aren't that surprising. It's the
that's
version of the
it's
Texans
the
that we've
version of
gotten.
it. Yeah, it's the way that they got there where the defense is playing like a top 6, 7 level. I thought they would kind of take a step and not get into that range necessarily. And I didn't think the offense would. I think you could have expected maybe some degree of like the arrow's not always going to point up with the offense, but for them to take like 3 steps back has been pretty shocking.
If you told me that they were like the 16th best offense in the league, the 12th best defense in the league, and they finished 10-7,
Exactly.
I'd be like, all right, I mean, maybe I can understand that. But for them to be truly like a definitively below average offense and one of the best defenses in the league, and for that to be the version of the Texans we got, I just did not anticipate that happening. We talked about this a couple weeks ago, where if the Texans were going to do anything and make any sort of noise in the playoffs, it was going to have to be on the back of their defense. So why don't we just start there? We're going to talk about both sides of the ball here. Let's kick this off with when the Chargers have the ball. What is the number one thing you were looking for when Justin Herbert and those guys are on the field on Saturday?
I'm a little bit scared for this Chargers team because I think in most cases they have been a really, really good team against like being able to protect off of the edge. And against Will Anderson and against Daniil Hunter, you are really, really going to need to protect off the edge. Rashawn Slater is a little bit banged up right now, and so that gives me a little bit of pause there. And then I do think you're going to potentially have some issues along the interior against a team like the Texans. They don't blitz a ton, but I do think in the instances where you do throw stuff at them, throw some of these stunts and stuff like that. Like Will Anderson Jr. is another really good player who can kind of twist inside. So I think there's a world where if they can get a little bit of pressure onto Justin Herbert and kind of force him to get the ball out quickly, this Texans coverage unit I think is pretty comfortably favored in a game like this, where a handful of the Chargers receiving options are either not going to play or a question to play. Like Quentin Johnston is a little bit banged up right now. Josh Palmer is a little bit banged up right now. Kind of just leaves you with Lad McConkey and some guys. And I think that the Texans coverage unit has enough options to handle McConkey, even for as good a player as he is, that it's going to be really, really hard for them to move the ball consistently unless Justin Herbert just has one of those days, which to be fair, he's had a number of them this season despite not having a ton of help. But I do think the margin for error is going to be a little tricky here.
Yeah, I think the biggest issue right now, if you're just looking at the personnel for the Texans, the secondary specifically, after losing Jalen Petrie, they were able to move Kamari Lassiter inside. And that's what they've been doing when they've been a little bit healthier. But Jeff Okudah is now playing on the outside when he's healthy, and he's going to be back from a concussion this week. You'd think, all right, that's the spot that you want to circle if you're an opposing offense. Well, the best Chargers receiver plays inside. So Quentin Johnston and Josh Palmer, and Palmer's probably not going to play in this game, but Quentin Johnston even, the Chargers aren't necessarily equipped to take advantage of where this Texans secondary is the weakest. So now, where do you really feel like the Chargers have a definitive advantage? Where are you scared of this matchup if you're the Texans? And I don't necessarily know where I would land outside of Justin Herbert doing like 3 or 4 ridiculous things, which he is liable to do, but that it's hard to necessarily rely on stuff like that.
It is. And like in a lot of other cases with a lot of other offenses, you could say, oh, well, just run the ball in the Houston Texans. I mean, we saw what what the Baltimore Ravens were able to do
Yeah.
to them a couple of weeks in Week 17. In theory, that is what this Los Angeles Chargers team wants to be, and it's what they've tried to be for the first like 10 weeks of the season. But at a certain point, they realize they are just not a team that is really good at running the ball. And so I don't know if they're going to be able to consistently do that in this game. And so I think that is going to be an issue for them. You're kind of just left thinking, okay, if we can't run the ball, if we're going to be outmanned in the receiver versus, DB matchup, how do we move the ball? The best weakness to probably attack is to try to get the Houston Texans defense over the middle of the field, specifically the linebackers, because I think their safeties actually do play. They're playing pretty well. Like Bullock has been better over the course of the year, and I think that that's helped them a lot. But you can still get these linebackers in coverage, even though they're healthier now. So to me, this is just going to be a game of like how many times can Greg Roman find some answers to get guys over the middle of the field, especially in zone coverage when they're not just manning up Lad McConkey.
You mentioned this twists and stunts, and I think that becomes important in this game because the Chargers tackles are the two best offensive linemen. Rashawn Slater's banged up, so that's something worth noting. He didn't play in Week 18. You actually had Trey Pipkins bopping out to right tackle and Joe Alt moving over to the left side. And the one sack early in that game is a twist where they're taking advantage of Damari Sawyer, who it sounds like even with Alt and Slater healthy, we may see a bit of a rotation at right guard in this game between Pipkins and Sawyer. Sawyer's huge. Like he's just a massive human being. He's in there, I think, in part to help them run the ball, which this doesn't always work, but I think you can pick on him a little bit in pass protection. So whether that's twists and stunts or whether that's the interior defensive lineman, and that's why I actually think that Denico Autry, who is not slated to play in this game, him missing this game might be more important against an offensive line constructed like the Chargers than some of the other teams that the Texans might have to go against later in the playoffs.
It to a degree it kind of offsets the Chargers potentially not having some of their pass catchers, right? Like it's gonna stink for the Chargers to not have a lot of those pass catchers, but to a certain extent, it almost doesn't matter who Justin Herbert is throwing to. He's gonna find guys if he has the time. Well, now if he's gonna have a little bit more time because Denico Autry is not going to be hunting him in the pocket and beating both of his guards, it's a pretty decent baseline for this Chargers offense to have.
And it does sound like Quentin Johnston may play. He's been
Mhm.
sick this week and he's been dealing with some stuff, but I think Josh Palmer, that feels like it's a little bit of a tougher road, Beller. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like that's kind of how things are setting up. So it feels like the Texans' best shot here is to kind of muddy this game up a little bit, having it be low scoring. So let's get to the other side of the ball and talk about whether they can do enough over there. When the Texans have the ball against this Chargers defense, what is the number one thing you're keeping an eye on?
Nico Collins. The only I think when I looked at this game, I know this is actually technically the closest line of all three of the playoff games, but one, it's though you have the wild card team technically favored, so I think that kind of swings how you would talk about it. But the only path I really see to the Texans winning this game is Nico Collins catches like 4 yards beyond 20 or four passes beyond 20 yards, where it's just shot play, shot play, shot play. And in theory, you can get that against this Chargers team, right? This Chargers team overall doesn't allow a lot of explosives, but part of that is because they do a really, really good job of if you throw short, they don't miss tackles, and so they don't give you explosives that way. But you can beat them over the top. We've seen the Bengals do it. We've seen the Bucks do it. If you can hit them on some of these double moves, or really just get your big guys strafing down the field, I think that is the way to beat them. The issue is going to be like, can they protect CJ Stroud long enough to unlock that? That's where I think this starts to become a problem. And I also think it is especially a problem because kind of like on the other side of the ball, in theory, you can run the ball on this Chargers run defense. They were kind of good early in the season, but it started to wane over the course of the year. They're a team that wants to play a lot of too high anyway, so it kind of makes sense that you can bully them in that way. But the Texans are a really bad running offense, so you're probably not going to be able to unlock that. So I still think this is going to be a game where, like I said, 3-4 times in this game, it's going to be a 2nd and 8, 2nd and 9, and they just have to find a way to hit Nico Collins down the field.
So I think it's a very good thing to point out because the Texans have struggled this year throwing against too high looks because in part they've been able to they can't run teams out of them.
Yeah.
And so now last year I think just by structure alone they faced a lot more single high than they've faced this year. Teams just aren't afraid of what they can do on the ground, and I think that's one of the reasons along with their inability to protect receiver injuries, etc., why this passing offense has struggled. Early in the season, this would have been one of the worst possible matchups for this Texans offense because of how good that Chargers defense was in some of those too high looks. That has shifted a little bit. And I think that's worth keeping in mind because we're going to look at the Chargers. And I think a lot of people that didn't watch them a ton this year are going to look at season long stats, going to look at season long points allowed and be like, oh, this is one of the best defenses in the league. They have felt like a slightly different unit in the back half of the year. So in the first 10 weeks of the season, first 11 weeks of the season, the Chargers were third in the NFL in success rate and fourth in the NFL in EPA per dropback in split safety coverages. Starting in weeks 12 through 18, that goes to 24th in EPA per dropback and 27th in success rate. And so that timeline almost directly aligns with Alohi Gilman getting hurt and being out of the lineup and Tony Jefferson coming in. Elijah Molden has also been banged up. And why it matters that it's two safeties that have been hurt is that the Chargers don't want to play Derwin James solely at safety. So with the Ravens, when they were having their issues, they decided, you know what? We love that Kyle Hamilton could be this movable piece for us. We're just going to put him in the back end, though, because we think that's our best chance at stability. The Chargers haven't elected to do that. Even with injuries at safety, they're still moving Derwin around a ton. And that's put Tony Jefferson into the lineup as one of the starting safeties in some of those looks. Tony Jefferson wasn't on a roster last year. Like, he's somebody that I think was mostly a depth piece for them in an ideal world. He's been thrust into the lineup, and you've been able to hit them over the top way more often lately than you were early in the season. Just think back to that Bucs game and some of those explosive plays that the Bucs were able to get. So if you can get a couple of those, if you're the Texans, if you can get those Nico Collins shots, does that change the complexion of the game a little bit?
And I think that's a really important thing to bring up with the safeties, because a lot of what they do is not, sometimes we just bucket all like too high stuff together, but like cover two is very different from the way that quarters plays. When you're playing quarters, a lot of the way that they like to play, or cover six, where one half of it is quarters.
Which they play a ton of, by the way.
Exactly. They play a lot of that. Whoever the quarter safety is in cover six, or if you're just playing quarters to both sides, those safeties have to play aggressive. Like, you are driving on routes in front of you, and you have to be really disciplined about when is the right time to do this and when do I need to stay in my zone. Whereas cover two is just like, you're playing deepest of the deep in your half. And so you can still get beat, mentally, but it's a little bit easier of a job in a sense, like mentally, and what you're tracking. So they play a lot of quarters. And again, if they're going to find ways to get these guys biting on stuff that they're not supposed to be biting on, and you can get Nico Collins running on that post behind them, whether it's like, some of your dagger concepts or mills where you're running like a dig route from the slot and then a post over it, like stuff like that. I think that is the way to abuse them. It's just, again, it comes down to me. Can they pass protect long enough? And I'm not entirely sure, because I do think this Chargers, their front and their pass rush isn't great, but I think against an offensive line like this, it's more than enough.
It's funny, if you look at the coverage menu for both of these teams, it's actually pretty similar. Front structures are different, system is very different, but the coverage menu is actually pretty similar. On early downs, the Texans play like 25% quarters, which is the fourth highest rate in the league. The Chargers are right in line with that. They play a similar amount of cover three. What flips is the Texans play a lot more man on early downs, and especially on third down. The Chargers, like you alluded to, they play more cover six, where there are some quarters principles baked in there. The Texans, and I think we probably should have mentioned this just in how they can get after Justin Herbert, the Texans blitz a shitload. Like, the Texans on third down are one of the heaviest man blitz teams in the entire league. And I would not be surprised if we saw some of that, because they're not afraid of the pass catchers and they know that they want to heat up the quarterback. So I think that's a path to them potentially bothering Justin Herbert. On the other side, talking about the Texans offensive line, they have been abjectly bad for most of this season. This has been one of the worst pass protecting groups in the league. They've done some tweaking up front, though. So again, if we're trying to think about what's different now compared to what the rest of the season has looked like, they've moved Titus Howard, who was their starting right tackle, to left guard, which has just been a black hole for them the entire year. Juice Scruggs, who was their starting center for a good chunk of the year, he's now slid in for an injured Shaq Mason at right guard, while Jarrett Patterson is at center and Blake Fisher is at right tackle. The early returns are that it has been marginally better than some of the offensive line combinations they were rolling out for a majority of the season. So fingers crossed, if you're a Texans fan, you'd hope that this is the best version of your offensive line heading into the most important game of the season.
I think it probably is marginally better, because what they were doing for the first 3-4 months of the season was, like you said, arguably the worst offensive line performance of any team in the league. they needed to be exponentially better. Like they needed to level up 4 times. They maybe went up like a half a level with some of these changes. I just don't think that it's going to be enough to do a whole lot here.
For each of these games, I just wanted to talk about a supporting piece that people should be thinking about as we go into the game. I will let you throw these out. Your names for these are incredible, by the way. You just decided to
I
take as
dug deep.
deep of a cut as you possibly could for every single one of them. So who is the supporting piece in Texans Chargers that you think people should be keeping an eye out for?
Yeah, so to me, I mentioned earlier a little bit how if you just look at the receivers for the Chargers and you look at the DBs for the Texans, man, that is Texans' favorite. They're going to be able to have some answers for Lad McConkey. So to me, it's like, okay, we need to find a way to attack the Texans over the intermediate area, especially over the middle. I think it could be like a big Stone Smart game. If you actually look at the numbers for the Texans, hear me out for a second. The Texans are good against
I
tight
I
ends.
I haven't done this all season because I think it's disrespectful and I don't like to draw comparisons. This is the most Nate Tice bullshit of
Yeah.
all time. It's for just to be like, "Oh, this is a real stone smart game that we're going with here." And I say that with so much love and affection.
The most exactly as much admiration as possible. I've got to allude to the former co-host every now and then, and so this is my way of doing it, especially in the playoffs. What a time to do it, right? But the Texans over their overall numbers against tight ends are actually pretty good this year. But a lot of that is again, like you mentioned, they play a lot of man. You can get Petrie on some of these tight ends, yada yada. When they go into purely zone, they become a firmly average pass defense against tight ends, and that tracks, right? Like these tight end or these linebackers are just not great in coverage, even if they're going to be a little bit healthier. So I think if they're going to struggle to get some of these wide receivers open, could be a big Stone Smart game, and we've had a couple of them this year. Like this isn't we. It's not like we haven't seen it yet.
I'm cheating for most of mine and going with somebody that's not that deep on the roster or on the depth chart. The guy that I think is just worth watching this game is Kamari Lassiter, and it's for this reason. When the Texans are in 11, again, they have been comfortable putting Okuda outside and moving Lassiter into the slot now that Jalen Petrie is hurt. Why that matters, especially in this game, that's where Lad McConkey is going to be when the Chargers are in light personnel. When the Chargers are in heavy personnel, that means McConkey's outside, and that means Lassiter is back outside. So I think what Lassiter is doing both in the slot and as an outside corner in this game against Lad McConkey is going to go a long way in determining what sort of success the Texans defense has.
That's a great point because I think sometimes we bash Greg Roman, but I think he's smart enough to know that trying to get away from Derek Stingley as much as possible is the goal here, and so it's going to have to be a big Lassiter game for sure.
Yeah, I was trying to look this up while you were talking, but the Texans do mostly play their corners by side. So Stingley
Yeah,
has played of his 909 outside cornerback snaps, he has been on the left side on 735 of those. So this probably isn't as simple as we're going to have Derek Stingley follow Lad McConkey around. They don't play enough man coverage to justify those sorts of tells in the same way that moving a Patrick Surtain Jr. or Joey Porter Jr. around might actually be okay for those teams. The Texans aren't really constructed that way. So again, I think there are going to be plenty of snaps where we're going to see Lassiter on McConkey, and I think that becomes important. All right, here we go. Steelers at Ravens, the Saturday night game. The Ravens are 9.5-point favorites against the Pittsburgh
I
Steelers.
don't like that number. Like right
I
off the
I
bat,
don't like that at all. If I were a Ravens fan coming into this game and we were like 10-point favorites against this Steelers team, no matter what sort of advantages you have and what sort of trajectory both of these teams are on, I would be a little bit scared about that. I would not enjoy that.
you could tell me Duck Hodges was coming back to start for the Steelers, and I'd be like, 10 points is a lot, man. I don't know.
Did Duck Hodges ever play a playoff game? No, right?
No. I think that was the year they like barely squeaked to 8-8, and Tomlin still kept the streak alive. But still, if you told me he was coming back at 10 points, is still a lot.
Listen, we were talking before the show, and you and Boa were talking about the 11-0 COVID year Steelers team. There are a lot of very weird footnotes from like the last 4 or 5 years of Steelers football. So anything to me is on the table. As we talk about just setting the table for this game and how these teams got here, I want to just really live on narrative street for a second. I think this is a very important playoffs for Lamar Jackson. And that's not because I think that he's flamed out or has a playoff problem or whatever. He's had a lack of success relative to team expectations in the playoffs. I think that's kind of undeniable. But why I think that he probably has more at stake or there's more to gain than any other player in these playoffs is that In those years where they have fallen a little bit short, and I would even include last year as part of this discussion, he was the MVP of the league, but there were still elements of Lamar's game that I think the right defensive coordinators could pick at. There are weaknesses that you could identify. Look at the 2 playoff games that the Ravens played last year. In the first half against the Texans, they're heating him up and really bothering the way that that Ravens team wanted to play. And then you go to that Chiefs game, and the Ravens offense really, really struggled with Spags throwing a lot of funky blitz looks at them. That element of Lamar's game, that inability to really, again, play the way he wants to when teams are speeding him up, that was the last thing in the back of my mind as I was considering what was keeping Lamar from that level that Josh Allen was at, and ultimately that Patrick Mahomes was at. I no longer have those. Like, we've talked about this all season. This is the best version of Lamar that has ever existed. He is going into the playoffs as a more complete player than we have ever seen him. And so I think he's more equipped to deal with some of these issues and to kind of overcome some of these storylines that have crept up about him as a playoff player for the first 5-6 years of his career.
I couldn't agree more. And this is such a cool game to do it, that you're gonna get to do it against the Steelers, against the
Because it's
team
one of
that
those other things that he struggles with, right? So
yes,
you're just like,
exactly.
you're checking multiple boxes potentially. A playoff win over the Steelers does a lot for you if you're Lamar
Exactly.
Jackson.
And this Steelers team, when they've seen him this year, they have tried to heat him up, and it worked a little bit more in the first game. Second game was kind of iffy, and I think both sides won a few reps there. Like Highsmith ended up having a strip sack, but also Lamar beat them a number of times. I actually do think that last game is kind of speaks to what you're talking about, where Lamar is better against the blitz, and to me, the offense is better against the blitz. There were a couple
Yes.
of instances in this game where they put Isaiah Likely outside in like a 2 wide receiver set, and they fast motion, or they like short motion him back into the slot, and it just changes who is covering who. There's one, I think the second time they do it, where they're backed up in their own end zone, and they get Isaiah Likely, so he's starting outside, but he moves inside to the slot. Now Beanie Bishop is covering him. Huge size matchup. Likely just wins on a corner out, and Lamar throws a beautiful ball.
Just
Like that.
insane ball. I blue skied
It,
about that yesterday.
yeah.
The term I used to describe it was just buttery. Like, it's just a
Yeah.
buttery throw on that. And he's got a million of those corner outs this year.
It was so good, and that to me spoke to it. That one is everything, right? It's the offense setting him up, and then it's Lamar making the right read, the right throw, placing it perfectly outside the numbers. And so that you just didn't see that at the same rate that you saw in previous seasons. Like, you maybe would get one or two plays like that in previous seasons, or in previous games, like last year and the year before. Now it's like, man, he can just do this 5-6 times a game, where he's just, everything is perfect for him, and he knows where the answers are, and he makes the throw. So I think if he can do it again in the playoffs against a team that has already seen him twice this year and a handful of times over the course of the years, obviously, I think it would really, really go a long way. I'm, of course, not someone who cares that much about it. Like, I'm still extremely pro Lamar no matter what. And I'm not saying you're anti Lamar, but I think it would be nice to not have to make these arguments if they could just get the win.
Here's why I think that to me, there's more at stake for Lamar in these playoffs than even somebody like Josh Allen. Josh Allen doesn't have the MVP award, but Josh Allen has objectively played very good football in the playoffs.
Yeah.
There have been some down moments for him, but you can point out several like, holy shit, Josh Allen playoff performances. The wild card weekend game that he had against the Patriots, I believe in 2021, was absurd. Like, if you look at those numbers, they're crazy. The 13 seconds game and losing to the Chiefs in that game is absolutely not on Josh Allen.
Every other quarterback loses that.
He was wildly good in that game, and he was pretty darn good last year against the Chiefs. The problem last year against Kansas City was not Josh Allen. The problem was their defense could not stop anything on the other side of the ball. So I think you could absolutely tell yourself a story that most of the Bills' playoff failures in Josh Allen's tenure have not been directly related to Josh Allen's play. Even if you're a believer that Lamar is the driver of the regular season success a lot of the time for the Ravens, you can't say that about Lamar. He has not played his best football in the playoffs. And so that's why I think even with the 2 MVPs and potentially a third in the case already, there is still more to be gained from a storyline perspective for Lamar over the next month than there even is for somebody like Josh Allen, who does not have a Super Bowl.
Yeah, and like this game is only the stepping stone, and then obviously the next game, assuming it is, hopefully if they can get to the championship weekend against Lamar or against Josh Allen, that's when we could really put some of this to bed.
It's funny because somebody asked me yesterday, one of our coworkers, Alex Sample, who I was having coffee with yesterday, was like, "Are you gonna travel at all for the playoffs?" And I was like, "I don't know." It's like my dog just died, and I think I just wanna kinda, like, hang with my wife before I go to the Super Bowl, and I'm sitting there thinking about it, and I was like, "Man, if Josh Allen plays against Lamar in the divisional round, like, am I really gonna be able to say I don't wanna go to that if they give me the chance to do it?" So, I say now that I'm not gonna travel for any playoff games, but if we get that one, then that's gonna be a hard one to say no to. On the other side of this, from a storyline perspective, I wanna ask you just, like, a pretty simple question. As we round toward the playoffs and the Steelers are again 10-point underdogs heading into wild card weekend, what do you make of just the 2024 Steelers season and the place at which the Mike Tomlin Steelers have arrived?
I think it's just like another kind of just mark on the wall that this Steelers franchise is really, really, really good at being competent and raising the floor. And I think we've seen that especially on offense. Like, I think hiring Arthur Smith isn't the most inspired thing you can do. No, but I think he's been solid. They invested a ton in the offensive line and kind of got unlucky with some of the injuries to like Fontenot and stuff. And obviously, the offensive line is always going to, in theory, lift the floor of your offense. They go out and get Russell Wilson, who, again, maybe not a ceiling raiser, but is kind of a floor raiser for you. The problem to me is just none of this stuff really matters if you don't have any star players on the offensive side of the ball. And I don't know the last time they had a star player on that side of the ball. Like it is probably the Triple B roster with Ben, Antonio Brown, and Le'Veon Bell. And for that to, I mean, when was the last time that roster was good and together? Like 6 years ago? 7 years ago? Like that's a long time to not have any star players. And so they've kind of just been stuck in this mode on offense where it pretty rarely feels like totally incompetent, but racing the floor when you have absolutely no ceiling just doesn't do a lot for you, especially when your defense, like in theory, right? Like you can have below average offense, elite defense, and you can win 12 games. Well, the defense isn't elite. It's pretty good. It's not elite, especially this year. And I think that's been some of why they haven't been the team that they maybe want to be.
I'm looking back at it right now. In 2020, the Steelers were 12-4. Deontay Johnson was their best receiver. He had 923 yards that season. In 2019, it was an 8-8 team that was not very good on offense. 2018 is probably the last year where we can really talk about it that way. Antonio Brown had 104 catches, 1,300 yards, 15 touchdowns. Like that was the last time where this team felt like really, really good offensively. And that's been a while. Like that was 6 years ago now. And I
That
look
was
at just this.
before a global pandemic.
Yeah, a global pandemic that saw the Steelers go 11-0 to start that
Right,
season.
right. Of course. Back to that somehow.
I I look at what the Steelers did this offseason, and I think that the Russell Wilson thing is just such a great indication of how this team has operated on that side and what they try to do. Signing Russell Wilson for the minimum, they got significantly more than $1 million worth of production from Russell Wilson. Like, relatively, that is a smart football move in a vacuum. But to what end? Like, where are you going when you're getting these incremental gains on these very modest bets that you continue to make on offense? And that's kinda how I feel about it. It's like, yeah, if you get a 4% return on like a $10 investment, it's like, all right, congratulations. Like I think technically it was probably the right thing to do, but it's not overly exciting. And it doesn't allow you to fight fire with fire in a conference where you're having to play against the Ravens, the Bills, the Chiefs, a Bengals team with Joe Burrow that you lost to last week. And so that's kind of where this team has arrived, is that the floor on offense is higher, but the ceiling is so defined. And on the defensive side of the ball, you need to be unbelievable on that side to warrant this sort of mindset and approach on offense. You need to be like a transcendent sort of defense. They have good players on that side, but they're not that sort of unit. And even if they were, it's hard to string 3, 4 wins together in the playoffs as a team constructed like that. And I don't, part of me doesn't feels bad criticizing them for this because I don't have a solution. I putting that forth, I think would make this a little bit easier to do. But I still feel like if I were a Steelers fan, I would be looking at all of this and I would just be like, what's the route out of this? Like, where are they going to find the difference makers and especially the difference maker at quarterback to eventually break what feels like a pretty consistent cycle? It's not incompetent anymore like it was under Matt Canada, but it's uninspiring in a way that it would just meet me a little bit cold if I rooted for this team.
I think in a lot of cases we kind of overrate or over talk about the idea of like you're too good to end up finding the answer at quarterback, if that makes sense, especially in the draft. But the Steelers, for the last like 6 years, actually have been too good to find their
Absolutely.
answer at quarterback. And then the one time they swing on quarterback was a draft class that everybody knew was not a very good quarterback class, which is kind of unlucky, or maybe that's just bad decision making by them. They should have got a veteran, whatever. But they have just kind of been too good to end up in the top 10 where you can take one of these you can take a Jaden Daniels at 3 or something like that, or Drake or at 2, or Drake May at 3, something like that. They're just never going to be in that position. And if you're not going to be in that position, you kind of have to hit on the mid-tier swing on a veteran. And they tried that twice in the same offseason with Justin Fields and Russell Wilson. And neither of them worked to the same degree that we've seen even Baker Mayfield work in Tampa Bay, or obviously to a greater extent, Sam Darnold in Minnesota. And so for them to kind of struggle to find both of those avenues after, at this point, 3 or 4 different swings on both sides, it's very frustrating. And to me, that would change so much of it. Like, if this exact team had Geno Smith, I would actually be scared of them being able to win playoff games against a lot of these teams. But with what they have now, where instead of quarterback 12 or 13 like Geno, it is instead quarterback 22, it's just not nearly as threatening to me.
Yeah, and they never had their Lamar. Like, just think about
Yeah.
where the Ravens were and the fact that you can draft Lamar Jackson 32nd overall and what that has now done to reshape your franchise. That sort of bet, or like you're talking about, hitting on one of those Baker or Geno guys just has not happened for this team. They've tried. Like, they've tried with Justin Fields, they've tried with Russell Wilson. It just has not unfolded the same way it has for these teams that have got a little bit luckier. All right, let's dig into the nitty-gritty here. Start with the Ravens and when they have the ball. What is the number one thing you were looking for when Baltimore has the ball in this game?
I mean, it kind of comes back to a little bit of what we said with the blitz. The last 2 times these teams played, the Steelers blitzed the hell out of Baltimore. And again, it worked fairly well for the first time. Second time, I think Baltimore had a lot better answers than they were able to find it. I mentioned a couple of the ones where, Isaiah Likely is outside, motions inside, and some of that is scheme stuff. Some of it too is just Lamar Jackson. Like, he had one on a deep crosser to Andrews where he knows he's getting a free rusher, and Lamar hits the top of his drop, does a very cool and calm, like, adds one extra step to his drop back to give himself that space, and just tosses one right into Andrews' breadbasket. And so I think the fact that he looks so calm against the blitz, I think that's going to go a really, really long way in this game. And then to me, especially in the last game that these two teams played, every time the Ravens ran the ball and did some sort of eye candy, whether it's a shift before the snap, motion across. Sometimes they would double motion, like they would motion pre-snap and then they would motion another guy at the snap, and they would just like get all this double stuff. Or whether it was pullers or traps, whatever it was, that was where you really saw them beat the hell out of the Steelers up front. Because honestly, on a lot of their like, hey, you just have to beat the guy in front of you stuff, the Steelers were winning. Like, Watt was beating guys, Hayward was just mauling everybody in front of him. It was when you got eye candy and you got linebackers to be in the wrong spot, or the safety who's rolling down, he's in the wrong spot. That's when they were able to beat them. So if Monken can kind of cook it up again, and I think he's going to need to, that is how the Ravens end up winning this game.
The Ravens stacked up a lot of rushing yards in that game. It was a lot of explosive runs, but their down to down rushing success rate in that game was only like 42%. And I saw the exact same thing that you did. A lot of the zone runs in that game, the Ravens aren't winning at the line of scrimmage. Like, what Cam Hayward did to Patrick McCarry like multiple times in this game is not safe for work if like you go back and look at the footage. And so the Steelers were beating themselves a lot, just being displaced by either, like you mentioned, motion, pullers, or guys just slicing across the formation. So if you can have a little bit better eye discipline, I don't think that you're outmanned up front in the same way that a lot of other teams are when they play against the Ravens. The blitz point, I think, is very important. The Steelers had 2 of their 3 highest blitz rates of the season when they played against Baltimore. And I think that the Steelers understand we need to do something extreme against what the Ravens are offensively right now. They played 61% man in that week 16 game, which is their highest rate of the season, which is a pretty significant amount. I think the biggest difference, and if you look at the week 11 game, there was still a lot of blitzing and still a lot of man coverage. I think the more important adjustment in all of this is what the Ravens did. The Ravens in that first game, they're getting 5 out in the pattern a lot, and they didn't do that as much in week 16. I was trying to look for some numbers on this, and there just aren't really that many good ones because figuring out how many guys are in protection is sometimes hard to do because the back release is a little bit late.
Mhm.
Sometimes you'll have a chipper. But if you look at what the Steelers were doing or the Ravens were doing in this game, they were really keeping tight ends in protection and the back end protection more often than they were in week 11. And I think that their answer was if Lamar is comfortable back there and he has time, we think, especially with Joey Porter Jr. getting hurt in that game, we can take advantage of this team on the back end. We're just not going to let the pass rush beat us, and we're especially not going to let TJ Watt beat us. In the 25 or so dropbacks that Lamar had in that week 16 game, I could probably count two or three times where TJ Watt did not have somebody chipping him or there was a tight end actually staying into that side. So I wonder if you're the Steelers, Watt aligns on that side 95% of the time. Do you try to move him around maybe a little bit more often to allow him to affect the game in a way that he might not have been able to when it was a little bit more static? That's not typically what they do, but again, they've been willing to be a little bit more extreme when they've played against the Ravens. And when you're this big of a hole coming into the game, do you try to do some stuff that you haven't done before?
I would honestly guess that they don't move him much, and it's more like how many new answers can we find to blitz the other side
Sure.
of the line and really make Ronnie Stanley think, Patrick McCarry, really force them to, the backs. Like Derrick Henry is okay in pass protection, but I don't really think that that's what they want him doing. And so I think if you can force them to really pick things up on that side, and honestly, like I think Stanley has played well for most of the season. They got after him a little bit in this game. Like Alex Highsmith in particular beat him a handful of times. And so if they can beat him on some one-on-ones and then just a number of times, whether it's bringing the nickel or, rolling a safety down, whatever it is, just making them pick up extra stuff, I think maybe that is the way to do it. And then you just, again, force them to consistently commit the resources to Watt. Because like you mentioned, there were only a handful of plays where they didn't chip TJ Watt in this game. I remember one specifically where they didn't, and he ends up beating Roger Rosengarten instantly around the edge and forcing a pressure. So like that is the reason you don't do it. And so I expect the Ravens to be pretty cognizant about that again.
One other very big difference that we have to talk about here is that Zay Flowers, the Steelers did not have Joey Porter Jr. for a huge portion of that game, and the Ravens did have Zay Flowers. Well, now Joey Porter Jr. is going to be back for this game, and the Ravens already, it's been announced, Zay Flowers is not going to play here. So now, if you're going to play a ton of man coverage again, are we a little bit worried about the Ravens collectively being able to get enough separation against this Steelers team without Zay Flowers in the lineup?
We need Rashad Bateman to have the game of his life. And I think we've both been more excited about Rashad Bateman this year than I think we thought we might be coming into the season. And I think he's been better. But I still don't know. If I were to just rank, one on one, who do I think is a better player at at their position? To me, it is pretty comfortably Joey Porter Jr. And so I think that is going to be a really difficult matchup for the Ravens because a lot of their other receivers are like nice wide receiver 4s and 5s to have in an emergency, but to have to play them in a playoff game against a team that is going to play a lot of man coverage on you, I think that's going to be difficult. So I think to me, it's more going to be how many times can they unlock these tight ends to really go make plays. It's probably going to be a lot more Isaiah Likely lining up like a wide receiver. And then Mark Andrews, a lot of the time, just lines up like a slot receiver anyway. So to me, it's probably going to be more about how can they unlock those guys. And I actually do think in terms of the body matchups and stuff, I do pretty heavily favor what the Ravens can do there. And so maybe this is just one of those games where Likely and Andrews combine for like 14 targets. And that is the way that they get through this game.
I wouldn't be surprised by that at all. Likely had a big day last time these two
Mhm.
teams played. Andrews had that big catch, like you mentioned. So that does make a lot of sense in terms of the Ravens' path forward. On this side of the ball, just if we're trying to build a way that the Steelers can keep this thing close, the same way they did in week 11, they need to take the ball away a couple times. Like that's not an interesting or creative answer, but I think it absolutely needs to be part of this. Like they need a Highsmith strip sack. They need a tipped ball from Cam Hayward that turns into an interception. And Lamar has not thrown interceptions this year, but he will put the ball on the ground. So if the Steelers are going to have a shot in this game, I feel like they need to win the turnover battle at least +2 if things are going to be close.
Yeah, they absolutely have to because the offense is probably not going to score enough by itself that you have to be able to strip possessions away from this Baltimore team. And it's a great point. Like I think Lamar, he only threw what 4 interceptions this year, and if you watch all of them back, you can be like, that's not really Lamar's fault. That's like a miscommunication. It's a drop. It's all this stuff. He does not give you any opportunities. But like you said, his kryptonite basically going back to college. I remember he had I think a game against Virginia where he had just an unbelievably silly fumble. Like this has just been a thing with Lamar basically forever. And even the last time they played the Steelers, Highsmith got him on a strip sack. So I do think that that is probably their best path. Is just you get one free rusher, or Highsmith just wins that one time, and you get the ball out of his hands.
You mentioned the Steelers not being able to put enough points up solely by virtue of what the offense is doing. Let's get to that side of the ball. I will say the Steelers' offense was better in that Week 16 game than the final score ultimately is going to tell you. It was 17-17 with 5 minutes left in the third quarter, and that involved a Russell Wilson fumble inside the 10-yard line. So there were elements of the Steelers' offense that did give Baltimore problems to an extent in that second matchup. What is the number one thing you were looking for on this side of the ball?
I mean, in theory, it should be we can beat the Ravens down the field because that is what it's one, it's what the Steelers want to do. And then two, it's what the Ravens struggled with for 10 weeks of the season. But I think what we've seen over the last month and a half is that ever since they moved Hamilton back to safety, and kind of, Marlon Humphrey playing a little bit more from the slot, they've been considerably better at defending a lot of these deep throws and not giving up these shot plays. And so I think it's going to be really, really difficult for the Steelers to move the ball because the other way that you would theoretically allow yourself to get into more of these situations where you can throw more down the field more comfortably is okay, we run the ball really well and we can get into 2nd and 4. And now the defense doesn't know what we're going to do. Okay, well, the Ravens are second in the league in rushing success rate as a defense, and they're really not going to give you a lot of those opportunities. And it doesn't really matter what type of body types or what type of runs you put against them. The Ravens have been really good against pretty much everything. So I think this to me, it's like you kind of need the George Pickens, thing to fall your way in this game. And I'm probably not very optimistic that that's going to be the case.
Like you said, if we were having this conversation 2 months ago, the path becomes pretty clear. You get a couple deep shots, and that kind of forms the basis of who you are offensively if you're Pittsburgh. Weeks 1 through 10, the Ravens were 28th in the NFL in EPA per dropback on deep passes. Weeks 11 through 18, they're third. So it's completely flipped where that is no longer an area where you can really take advantage of them. The one thing I saw in the first matchup that I feel like is worth bringing up is that when the Steelers were creating horizontal stretch within the defense, and they were doing this a couple different ways. They had kind of a I don't even know if it was like a shoulder fake, but at one point they had like a little fake swing to the left, and that's when he hits Skoranek up the seam, I believe, on the first drive of the game. So you're creating horizontal stretch and you're trying to attack back up the middle of the field. There was a big Calvin Austin bender at one point where I think that they weren't empty in a spread look. And so that's consistently where they were getting some of their best plays that second time around. And I looked up the numbers on this, and it was actually pretty stark. This season, the Steelers have been in spread formations on 23% of their plays, which is slightly above average. It's not a remarkable number. Week 16, it was 36%. So significantly higher. And that was the highest rate of the year to that point for Pittsburgh. In week 17 and 18, it was even higher than that game against the Ravens. So the last 3 weeks of the season are the 3 weeks with the highest spread formation rates of the year for Pittsburgh. And I do think that that's where they were at their best in that Ravens game. So I wonder if they're going to try to spread the Ravens out. And specifically, how can you pick on Malik Harrison a little bit in some of those looks? Because beyond those spread looks where they're attacking the middle of the field, they also had that Cordero Patterson wheel route touchdown when the Ravens were in man coverage. So that to me feels like the best path forward. Russell Wilson has been better in spread looks than he has been in condensed and normal formations this year. Not to a huge extent, but it does feel like the best version of this passing offense. And we have at least a little bit of evidence to back that up.
I wonder if that's just them realizing they're too slow to be a condensed a team because like honestly, because if you're gonna be one of these condensed teams, like you got to be. I feel like those Arthur Smith Titans teams were kind of a good example where your two receivers were Corey Davis and AJ Brown. Those are incredibly explosive outright outside receivers. So they made use of the fact that everybody else is kind of condensed to the middle of the field. If you're going to be a little bit slower and not have as many of these explosive options, either at tight end or at wide receiver, you kind of need to be able to manufacture the space just purely by alignment. So it actually kind of makes sense with what you're saying, where them getting to a little bit more spread stuff, just letting Russell Wilson see it, and kind of buying the space before the snap, if that makes sense. I see why that is doing a little bit more for them. I have such a hard time envisioning like Russell Wilson in a lot of spread formations winning a playoff game against a really good defense. It's hard for me to see that working.
That has to work in concert with you winning the turnover battle by a couple and
Right.
keeping this game much uglier than it should be. All right, who is your supporting piece in this game that you feel like people should be thinking about heading into the weekend?
I dug deep a little bit for this one again. I think we've all forgotten that last year, Keaton Mitchell was one of the most explosive players in the NFL. He came back 2 weeks ago. Now, he hasn't done a whole lot in those 2 weeks. And like week 18, the Ravens were like, not, the game wasn't really all that important. So I think we've kind of forgotten that this guy exists. But I think now, especially without Zay Flowers, who was their most explosive, under 8 yards, we get him the ball, he's going to go make a play for us. Keaton Mitchell is probably their next best option for that. And so I think trying to get him activated a little bit in that way, getting some easier yards that way, maybe he pops one big explosive that it should be 8 yards and he takes it for 20. I think that could be like a small little thing that helps swing this game in Baltimore's favor.
I'm with you in the sense that I think we've forgotten how dynamic Keaton Mitchell was when he was on the field last year. If you look at like any numbers from last season, it's him and Devon Achane like in the same zip code up
With
there
like
at the
nine
top in
yards of
terms of
carry.
explosive plays, etc. So that's a good shout. I mentioned alluded this a little bit earlier. I think, and these guys aren't no name players, but I think in terms of supporting pieces that have to have a big game, I think Alex Highsmith or Nick Herbig need to ruin this game for the Steelers. Like they need 1, 2, 3 explosive plays, and that happened the first time around. Nick Herbig, I believe, had that huge play on the 2-point play in Week 16. Alex Highsmith had the strip sack, like you alluded to. So if they're going to do everything they can, Baltimore, to make sure T.J. Watt doesn't have a huge impact on this game, then the other edge rushers, I think, need to have a monster influence on how this thing plays out for the Steelers.
That's a great shout. If those two guys can get 8 pressures and a strip sack instead of no strip sack and like 3 combined pressures on Ronnie Stanley, that is probably enough to make this game really gross.
All right, last one here. Broncos at Bills. This game is -8.5. The Bills are favored. As we talk about how we got here with both of these teams, I think the place where I land and the place where I'd want to start is that both of them are just so much better than a lot of people probably expected heading into the year. The Bills preseason over-under was 10.5. They won 13 games without having to play in week 18. Like you could make a really serious argument that the Bills were the best team in the NFL for huge chunks of this season. And even if you had faith in them being a potential playoff team, and I did, I thought that's kind of where they would top out. I didn't think that they would be at that upper tier this season just because of all of the different turnover that we saw, not only with the pass catcher spots, but with some of the pieces on defense. And so with Josh Allen playing the way that he did and just the job and the inertia of what this franchise is, them being a real deal Super Bowl contender and what was supposed to be or looked like it might be a soft reset year is extremely impressive. That's not to be outdone by what the Broncos did this year, who came into the season with a 5.5 over under, won 10 games, and are like definitively a playoff team. There are some teams they sneak into the playoffs, they're a wild card team. You look at some of the underlying metrics and it's like, I don't know. The Broncos are 6th in overall team DVOA heading into the playoffs. 6th. Like they have been so much better and so much more put together on both sides of the ball than I think a lot of people anticipated. And you and I talked a little bit about this in our awards show, just the idea of it being so fun to watch Sean Payton really get his groove back and really kind of re-announce himself as somebody who's putting together the type of offense we've seen from the Broncos over the back half of the season with a rookie quarterback. So both of these teams, I think, have just put together really impressive campaigns given what the preseason expectations were for both of them.
I'll start with Josh Allen and the Bills. You know what's funny is I guess it was like 3 years ago now or whatever. When the Chiefs traded away Tyreek Hill, it was like, man, this is such an amazing franchise, but they've got to take a step back, right? Like this is such a huge move for
It's
them to
very
think.
similar, and
It's
I was
very
wrong about
similar.
that too.
Right, of course we were wrong. And then going into this offseason, we looked at the Buffalo Bills and it was like, man, the quarterback's great, but they've probably got to take a step back just with all these other moves. And then even with the Ravens to a degree, we were like, man, they're losing a lot on the offensive line, losing their great defensive coordinator. They might take a step back. Fast forward now, and they're the 2 and 3 seeds in the NFL, and they're both incredible in their conference. So I just think that that's funny on that side of the ball that both of those quarterbacks leveled up to such a degree that all of the stuff around them hasn't really mattered. So I think what the Bills have done is incredibly impressive in that sense. And then with the Broncos, I just can't believe the ceiling is there like this. When I looked at their season, what did you say it was 5.5? Their
Five and a half.
season. That to me, I looked at that and I was like, you know what? I feel pretty good that they'll get over that. Like, I still think Sean Payton is a good coach, even though I feel better about him now, obviously, than I did even before the season. And the defense has enough that it's like, okay, they'll get there. But, like, they probably max out at 8 wins, right? Like, it just didn't feel like this team had any ceiling. Like, their best player on offense was Courtland Sutton, but it felt like he had taken a step back and you weren't sure if he could get back there. And so for them to revive Sutton completely, the offensive line is suddenly one of the best in the league. Bo Nix has looked, he's not great, but like you check the box for what is good for a rookie quarterback. I think that's been a success. And then the defense has been top 5 in the league, which again, I thought they could be solid, but I didn't think that they would be one of the best in the league. So I don't know, man. What they've done on both sides of the ball, the coaching job from both Sean Payton and Vance Joseph, it's been really, really impressive to see.
Uh, the Broncos deserve so much credit for how legitimately excited I am to watch this football
Yeah.
game. Like, it's an 8.5 point line, and there's a chance that the Bills run away with this thing, but that's hard for me to imagine. Like, I think this probably is closer than that line and maybe some of the preconceived expectations would lead you to believe about this one.
I could not agree more. This is, I think, outside of obviously the Chargers actually being favored as the lower seed, this to me feels like the game where if it went the way of the underdog or the lower seed, I wouldn't be that surprised. And I know that sounds crazy because the Bills, maybe they do have a case for being the best in the league. And I've even said that myself. I said that like 6 weeks ago. But just the way that this Broncos team is built, particularly on offense, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, I just feel like it's kind of a quietly frustrating matchup for this Bills team that could really give them some issues.
Quietly frustrating is a very good way to put it. So let's try to build that case for why this could be a little bit closer than maybe that line would indicate. And let's start with where when the Broncos have the ball. What is the number one thing you were looking for on that side of the ball?
So to me, it actually kind of comes down to a few things, and I feel like they are just built in the exact way that is designed to give this Bills team some issues. One, this Bills run defense is okay, but I think if you can bully them and move them around, that is a way to really give them some issues. This Broncos offensive line, I think, can do that. Like McGlinchey can move people, Quentin Miners can move people, Bowles can move people. They're not a terribly explosive run game, but I think in certain matchups they do a really good job of being an efficient run game. And so I think that can be a plus for them. They are also a pretty good or the Bills, excuse me, are a bad screen team, like a bad screen defense team, particularly wide receiver screens. They have seen the third most wide receiver or tight end screens in the NFL. It's just over 70. So it's a handful of game. And they have the 11th worst rate by EPA per play on those instances. So 11th worst is not terrible, right? But when you're seeing it at that volume, it is very obviously a consistent good play for whoever the offense is. What have we said for the past 8 weeks now about the Denver offense? Man, Marvin Mims and those screens, they're really unlocking it and they're finding a way. And so I think that is a really annoying thing. And then to me too, I think for as good as this Bills secondary is and for how well it's coached and how well these guys see it, they're not really built to just have one corner go beat the hell out of another team's number one. Courtland Sutton is playing about as well as any number one in the league right now. He is playing incredibly well. I think that is another element that could be frustrating for them. So it's just like every way that you could attack this Bills defense, every weakness, they kind of have an answer for it. The Denver Broncos do.
I think that Courtland Sutton has played well this year. I think maybe against Rasul Douglas, I buy that. I think that Christian Benford has had a good enough season where I am giving Christian Benford the benefit of the doubt in that sort of moment.
I understand it, but I don't know, man. Maybe last week in particular, what Cortland Sutton was doing against like the Chiefs backups is really carrying a lot of weight for me. But
Yeah,
I feel
yeah,
like
those two big plays against Najee Johnson now
I,
means that
I
Christian Benford is garbage.
I still feel like every time I watch the Broncos offense and they're doing anything beyond like 7 yards, I'm like, holy hell, Cortland Sutton is the best player on the field right now.
I'm not letting this Christian Benford slandering go unnoticed. I'm kind of going to remind you of this when he has a monster game on Saturday. Or I guess this game is on Sunday. Whenever it happens, I'm going to remind you. I think the screen element of this is the first place my mind goes on that side of the ball, because we've talked about this with the Bills a little bit. Their run defense down to down has been very good this year, but you've been able to get some explosive runs against them. Like this, the second and third levels of the defense don't necessarily cover ground that well. And I think the screen game, it's a similar conversation. Like making them cover space and play in space is something that I would try to do. And the Broncos, with the way that they've used those receiver screens, are arguably better set up to play that way than almost any other offense in the league right now. So I think that's a potential issue. And what did you say? We call it quietly frustrating. Like that
Yes.
is a quietly frustrating potential issue for the Bills. And the other thing that I would notice is just how important pressure, I think, is going to play into this game. We've talked about this. Bo Nix has been a bottom 5 quarterback in terms of efficiency numbers when pressured this year. He just hasn't been pressured very often. The only team to allow a lower quick pressure rate, according to Next Gen Stats, than the Broncos this year has been the Ravens. That's it. The Broncos have been very good in pass protection. The Bills, when they get pressure and when they don't, have looked like pretty different defenses in coverage. So Buffalo this year, when they pressure the quarterback, they are 4th in the NFL in EPA per dropback. When they don't, they're 30th. And this Broncos
30th?
team, 30th. And this Bronco, let me make sure I have that right.
Oh, I like that. That's just insane that they would have such a drop off like that.
Yeah, I had to look at it like 10 different times to make sure it was right. They are 4th in the NFL in EPA per dropback when they get pressure. This year, the only defenses that have been worse on an EPA per dropback level and success rate, by the way, the only defenses that have been worse than the Bills when they haven't gotten pressure on the quarterback this year have been the Giants and the Panthers.
Oh, you can't be in Panthers territory. Like that is just absolutely disgusting.
So I think that getting pressure has been a huge part of the success that they've had on the back end, and this Broncos team just hasn't done that. And part of this that I actually think is very funny. Imagine if Von Miller is like the one that ultimately swings this thing for the Broncos. Von Miller's been good since he's been back in the lineup, and their pressure rate over the last month or so has actually been one of the highest in the NFL, in part because of what he's been able to do when he's been on the field. But just imagine if like a Von Miller sack and a half plus a forced fumble is ultimately what does in this Broncos season. Be a lot of conflicting feelings out there in the Rocky Mountains.
It would be too cruel. Maybe this season has been so much of a optimistic case that maybe you can live with it, but it still would be a very bittersweet ending to the way that the season has gone.
So I think that's a pretty good case for why this could be a little bit closer on that side than people might think at first glance. Let's get to the other side of the ball. When the Bills have the ball in this game, what is the number one thing that you're keeping an eye on?
I think there are a few things. First of all, I just want to point out that I think it's interesting that Joe Brady calls this offense very differently from a lot of what we've seen like high level offenses look like before. If we think of the Shanahans, the Sean McVays, Ben Johnson, a lot of that style of offense, it's very series based. It's we call this to unlock this to then unlock this. It's like you're trying to stack plays in a sense. That is not what the Bills do. The Bills, everything is a designery thing, and a lot of what they do in the passing game is trying to get information by alignment or using some of these motions, not even necessarily to get a guy running free, but just doing some of these like yo-yo return motions just to be like, hey, is that corner moving? Is he going to be running with this guy in man coverage? It's basically just we're giving Josh Allen as much information as possible before the snap, and we're going to hope that he makes us right. And Josh Allen, he's a pretty good player, so he makes you right a lot. And even when he's not, he's arguably the best scrambling quarterback in the league. And so even when everything isn't right, he can go make you right. And so I just think it's kind of fascinating the way that they've built this thing by kind of just each play is its own thing. And you just hope that Josh Allen is going to make you right. And I think it's especially interesting in this game where you've got a Broncos team that you're just going to get a lot of man coverage. And so it's going to come down to a lot of, all right, Josh Allen, can you make us right in these instances where our receiving core, who might be a little bit outmanned, a little bit outgunned here, is not going to be perfect? Can Josh Allen go make enough plays?
If you look at the numbers, Josh Allen against man coverage this year, they've seen a ton of it because we've talked about this. You play a lot of man when you're trying to make the receiving team, when the receiving talent beats you. And even if that group has been better than we expected coming into the year, it's still it's still not as good as Josh Allen. The Broncos have played the fourth most man coverage in the league. I don't expect that to die down against a Bills team that's seen the most man coverage in the NFL. Josh Allen, on an efficiency basis, has been very, very good against man coverage. He's second in the league in EPA per dropback. He's also 14th in success rate. And anecdotally, that makes sense. Think about the Bills games against teams that play a bunch of man coverage. They've been a little bit more volatile than you want them to be, but the highs have been extremely high. The Lions game is the best possible example, where they have all of these hugely explosive plays. But I do think that they can fall into some little ruts where it can be a little bit frustrating. And if the Broncos can put them in that position where they're limiting some of these explosives and the down to down success isn't there, what does that do to the Bills offense? So if you're not able to find easy completions and consistency throwing the ball, one of the things the Bills have been able to do in those sorts of games this year is they've been able to lean on the run game. That is an option for them because of how well they're equipped to run the football. Well, the Broncos have the best run defense success rate in the entire league. So is this going to be a game where the Bills are pushed into a level of volatility that we haven't really seen from them in this version of the offense with Joe Brady and Josh Allen?
I think that is exactly where we're going to arrive, is that this is going to have to be volatile Josh Allen game. And I think, in previous years, the volatility swing was closer to like 50-50. Now it's more like 80-20. Like, he's just that good of a player at this point. But I still think that is not exactly the way that you want to live in week one of the postseason. Like, if this was conference championship weekend, yeah, you're probably playing against a great team. You're probably going to have to live that way. To have to do that in your first game, I think is going to be very, very tricky. Because, yeah, like you said, this Broncos run defense is really good. Like, we've talked about some of these other players up front, Zach Allen, Nick Benito, what he's done for them. DJ Jones is still one of the best run defending defensive tackles in the entire league. And it's not just that the Broncos are a good run defense and that the Bills are a good run game. The particular way in which the Bills are a good run game is they're going to pull guys. They're going to run all these double teams. It's going to be duo and stuff like that. Okay, well, it's really hard to do that against a guy like DJ Jones because he just doesn't
Yeah.
give you that kind of space. And so I think, again, it's another one of those just small things that is it's a needle in the side of this Bills team that it's like, man, the Broncos just have the exact right answer for the way that you want to play.
And I think, again, that's what makes this potentially quietly frustrating for the Bills offense. All this being said, this is going to be a game where maybe you need 3, 4, 5 incredible moments from Josh Allen. He can give you those. And the Broncos, actually, you mentioned the scrambling earlier. That has been an issue for them in terms of back-breaking scrambles. I believe the number I looked up earlier this week, and I wish I had it in front of me. I'm pretty sure that the Broncos have given up the most scrambling first downs on 3rd and 10 or more than any team in the league this year. I think it's 6 of them. They gave up a couple to Justin Herbert. They gave up one to Patrick Mahomes. So that could be one of those situations where even if this is a quietly frustrating game for the Bills, it could be loudly frustrating for the Broncos offense if Josh Allen is going to make 3, 4, 5 of those plays over the course of the game.
And nobody is better set up to do it because he's unsackable. Like, he's been the least
Yeah.
sacked quarterback I've basically in the modern era, and especially, which is crazy, the way that he plays. That's a great point though, because this is a Denver defense that they're going to play man coverage, and in a lot of cases they're going to rush 5 or 6 guys. Okay, well, if the quarterback makes the first guy miss in the pocket, who the hell is going to tackle him? It's not going to be anybody, especially if it's Josh Allen.
Yeah, I was looking at the numbers because I was curious because the Broncos lead the league in sacks. Sometimes there's a gap, and we'll talk about this with the NFC preview in how good of a defense you are if you get pressure, how good of a defense you are if you get sacks. The Broncos aren't really one of those teams. Even though they're a sack heavy team, they lead the league in that metric. They've still been a good pass defense, even when they're forced to hold up a little bit longer in coverage. So that's just something to keep in mind because that was my first thought. It's like, this is the team that finished the season with the most sacks, quarterback who doesn't get sacked. How does that play into the matchup? Less than you might think, because the Broncos defense is still a very good defense overall. Before we get out of here, the supporting piece in this game that you think people should be looking out for?
Yeah, so one I already mentioned, DJ Jones. I just think he's going to be so instrumental to what they do on that side of the ball. But then to me, it's also I'm digging deep in the running back pool again. Ty Johnson, I think could be really really huge in this game for a couple of reasons. One, I think he is Buffalo's best pass catching back right now, or at least among like he's probably equal to what James Cook gives you. Obviously, Cook is just a significantly better runner, but he's their best off the bench type of pass catching guy. And the Broncos are not great at defending a lot of these running back runs. I believe they are the fifth worst in terms of EPA per play on running back targets as a defense. And that kind of tracks, right? Like neither of their linebackers, I think, are fantastic in coverage, and they play a lot of man coverage. So you are just, it's like, hey, man, you've just got to stick to this guy. And we saw what Joe Brady and Josh Allen can cook up when you get a team that is going to play a lot of man coverage with average or worse linebacker play in that Lions game where Ty
When the
Johnson has,
linebackers are the weakest links you have on the back end.
yes,
And I
when
think I
they're
think
the
I would
weakest link. Yes.
I would characterize the Lions and the Broncos in the same way. And that's why my guy to pay attention to in this game is Cody Barton. It's for the exact
Well, there you
reason that
go.
you're talking about. So I think, again, that matchup of what how the Bills, because I think this is kind of tying a bow on this man coverage idea. The Bills have been really good against man coverage and creating explosive plays. That's partially because of Josh Allen as an extender. And I think that they're very good at manufacturing separation because Khalil Shakir has been so much better than we expected this year. There have been some unbelievable tight window completions to Amari Cooper. Keon Coleman is obviously liable to dunk on people over the course of the game, but this is not a receiving core that is going to innately get a lot of separation based on the types of players we're talking about. You have to manufacture separation if you're Joe Brady and Josh Allen. There aren't that many guys in this Broncos defense that you feel good manufacturing separation against. The linebackers might be those guys. So that trying to get Ty Johnson on some sort of vertical route in the way that we saw against the Lions, do we see a similar sort of approach from the Bills offense in this game? All right. That is all we've got for, I was going to say today. That's not all we've got for today. That's all we've got for this show. Depending on when you're listening to this, the NFC version of the show will be in your feeds on Friday afternoon, probably sometime around mid-afternoon. So if you're listening to this early, check back around 3 o'clock, 2 o'clock Eastern to see if the NFC preview is there. If you're listening to this after that, the NFC preview is ready and raring to go for you guys. So very, very excited about a phenomenal weekend of football. Sincerely appreciate you guys listening. We will talk to you very soon.